There are four major areas of budgeting that I think need to be managed, and they start at the heart here and then work out. So the baseline is, what does it cost for us to stay in business? Companies I'm working with are not startups, they're sustainable second stage businesses. So they had a business last year, they're going to have a business next year. There is some kind of baseline that you can set of, here's what our underlying business costs. So you start with that. Then the next level to add on is kind of like an insurance policy, the reserves that you want to have. And this is just really a protection to ensure that your baseline has some protection. So if you have 3 months or 6 months of reserves in the bank, you can take some variability in your baseline business without having it disrupt things. So baseline is first, keeping the business going. Reserves are next, and again, that's still keeping the business going, but more about providing flexibility and providing options and protection than actually the operations themselves. The next step out of that are the investments, and investments are about improving or sustaining or growing the baseline business. So once I've established, here's what I need to keep the company in business as best I can, then I'm going to look at, how do I improve the business? How do I expand the business? And those are the investments. And there are ways to characterize investments. They're not all equal. So there's really a portfolio that you put together when you're doing your budget of, here are the investments, here's what I'm expecting those investments to provide for the business in the future. And then when you get through with those three circles, that's about ensuring the survivability of the business. One of my clients said, who the company has been around for over 100 years, and he said, my dad always said, protect the money tree. So job number one is making sure you have a healthy business. And these first three circles are about protecting the money tree. Once you've done that, then you can look at distributions. And this is really the profit left over. Some people, when I first look at their budget, they'll define profit as what comes after the baseline budget. I would argue that really the profit is what's left after you also do some insurance policy with the reserves, also do some improvement of the business with your investments. Now you can think about, how do we distribute that profit, and what's left of what can we pluck from the money tree for the business that the business has provided. So that's the overall. So I talked about moving from intuitive to structured. This is an example of something that provides structure. It's not too complex, but it does start to unpack the overall issue of budgeting in a way that can be useful, because now we have different pieces that we can treat in different ways. And so for today, for this slice, I want to talk about this baseline middle one and say, what does it look like to actually do that? So what I like to do is come up, this is a simple spreadsheet. Usually I do it in Excel, but I pasted it here for PowerPoint. So I have a category. Usually it's a higher level category, so maybe just a half a dozen to 10 of those, as opposed to, what do we spend on rent? What do we spend on telephones? What do we spend on office supplies? Just consolidate all of that into into like a general administrative category or something like that. You want to look at the budgeting level. You want to make sure you're compressing and consolidating detailed numbers into broader categories, because those will give you a better view of what's happening overall. So categories first, and then what was the budget or the spend last year? And then, a lot of us are familiar with the cost of living adjustment. I think there's a cost of doing business adjustment. So you just say, for salaries, actually, I put an example here. So for salaries, we're just going to do a 2% raise. So that's going to apply across, take last year's, multiply it by 102%. That's going to be a new baseline, part of the baseline. So you want to take the last year's first, then you want to apply some kind of percentage. It could even go down, but apply some percentage of how that's going to change simply from the cost of doing business and the cost of buying. And then you want to take into account any base change. And what I mean by that is if you hired 2 people, if you got rid of 2 people, if you know that I have several clients that have trade shows, major trade shows that only come up every other year. So there might be an adjustment down because the trade show doesn't happen in the coming year, or an adjustment up because the trade show does happen in the year. So just some kind of base change based on what you know is changing in that business. Again, we're only interested in the major expenses. And then if you add those together, you get your new baseline. And I have a client that's just going through a budgeting process now. Last year, they worked with a CFO who built it up from the ground and had this complex formula of number of units times the price or cost per unit, and it was simply overwhelming for the executives that had to do that because they've never done it before. And what they've moved to now is this baseline. Let's take what we did last year, let's make the adjustments, and then that'll give us a new baseline to start with. I have a similar worksheet for all 4 of the all 4 of the pieces of the budget, and that's the stuff that we go over on Friday in the Strategic Leader Program. So I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but this anyway is how I'd recommend you start to go through your budgeting process and start to lay a baseline. Let me also show you how you can use this as an analytical tool. So I'll go through strategic planning, annual planning, and then I'll go through the budgeting process, and then I like to step back from that and say, are the decisions we made in line with what I would expect us to do given the strategic landscape and given the strategic plan that we have. So let me show you, using variability of the size of the circles, what some different strategic situations might look like. So the first one up here on the right is if you're in a transition with a company, so and a lot of companies are in this space now. So you had a way of doing business. That way of doing business is no longer working as effectively as it was, and you have to create some kind of transition. Could be growth, could be changing out employees, could be starting up a new market, whatever it is. But there's some kind of meaningful strategic transition. What you'll find is that the baseline is baseline. The reserve, you'll probably have some reserve, but it'll be relatively small. And then you'll have some distribution probably, but again, it'll be pretty small. And the bulk of your budgeting is going to go into the investment. The bulk of your discretionary budget, so the reserves plus investments plus distributions, is going to go into investing because you have to make that transition. And one of the challenges that I see people getting into is they'll be in a transition environment, and they'll want to hold tight to their traditional numbers that they would often have with profitability or distributions and with reserves. I'm frequently arguing, no, we have to diminish profits. The point is to do this to make it through the transition as effectively and efficiently as possible. And we'll do that better if we take a hit on profits this year, make the investments that we need to make, and then we'll be healthy again. So transitioning is going to have major outsized investment piece. I also have some companies that I run into, especially if you think about a second or third generation family business, where they're really just milking it. And I would say the reserves, the investments are kind of the minimal amount that they need to do, and they're taking an outsized distribution. That's great as long as it's great. And then if you are under investing in the money tree, then eventually the money tree may well go away. And then if we go back to 2008 and hunkering down, what did that look like? You see the distribution go way down. You see the investments very small. It's really the baseline and then the reserves. People were saying, I'm going to spend on just what it takes to do business, and I'm going to, there's so much uncertainty that I want to make sure that I increase my reserves so that I can protect my core and protect my baseline. So that's just, again, there are probably a number of others too, but I think those are three basic ones that when you're done with your budget, you can say, do we think that any of these three apply to us and that we should have that we should have that profile. If not, if it's just business as usual, so to speak, then I would typically try to have the discretionary spending be approximately equal. It might be a third, a third, a third. It might be 20, 40, 40, but you want to have a healthy or a decent amount in each category.